Good afternoon, and my apologies. I continue to go by the clock at the back, which is means I'm right on time, and you are all slightly ahead of time. So, good afternoon. I'll look for any disclosures of pecuniary interest. I don't see any, so thank you very much. We really have one item on our agenda today, which is the 2017 to 2020 draft internal audit plan brought to us by our friends at Deloitte. And Ms. Barbone, do you have anything you want to say to kind of kick off, or should we just turn to them?
I think just this is the first plan and we've all reviewed it. I know they've had numerous discussions. So I think one of the points that I just addressed with them quickly is that as we look at it, one of the parts that hasn't been vetted is necessarily in terms of the timelines and the impact on business, and if some of the seasonality might be able to look at flexibility with potentially flipping timelines is certainly something that's been addressed and requested if that's possible, because we haven't looked at it in that light. So other than that, certainly everybody's provided feedback, and I'll allow them to present their plan.
Great, thanks very much. Jim Price from Deloitte. Just wanted to give a quick overview of the plan. You should all have a copy, of course. The plan was created since our last meeting when we talked at a very high level about how we're going to go through the process of creating the plan. And it was based on our internal audit methodology, where we took information from industry best practices as well as industry risk perspective, and I guess importantly as well, several interviews with management at the city, as well as council and other stakeholders within the city to create this the plan. The document itself includes an audit unit, a risk framework, audit universe, as well as the actual plan for the next 3 years, as well as some appendices that help give more information on the plan itself. So our thought was that there's two approaches we can take, is to either go through the plan in detail, or if the committee members have had an opportunity to review the plan and would like to just go to questions, that could be an approach as well. So it's...
I'll turn to committee. What would be your desire to say at a high level, or do you want to go through the detail? Michael?
Oh.
Oh, there we are. Yeah, well, thank you. I think I'd like to hear a presentation, although I have gone through it, and I actually, I like the plan. I thought the risk assessment was very thorough. I even like the timing on some of the things. I'm pleased with what I see, so I might like to just sit back and hear a little more about it.
Okay, let's walk through it.
Okay, great, thanks. This is Catherine Constantopoulos, also from Deloitte. I'll start off just by going through a little bit of the methodology approach that we took, because it probably is a little bit different than what you've seen in the past. And referring to our page 4 in the document, you would see the risk framework. And really this is part of an essential part of our internal audit planning methodology. And what we've done here is we have taken our Deloitte framework and tailored it to the city based on both what we know of industry, but also based on the results of the interviews and the review of the documentation that we had around the city. What you would see highlighted here are either risks that were brought up commonly, things that we commonly see within municipalities as key risks, and the bolded ones are those that were highlighted most frequently in our discussions or interviews as being the top risks or top considerations that were brought forward by the individuals interviewed. What this risk framework then allows us to do is, once we've developed the audit universe, which starts on page 5 of our internal audit plan, The audit universe is really meant to be all of the different areas that we could potentially audit as part of internal audit. And it is higher level. There will be many subsets or sub-processes within that, as well as systems within that. But it gives us an overview of the city, and you would see that it includes, in addition to the department's processes, it also has the various boards or commissions as well in there in terms of what we could potentially be looking at. What this allows us to do then is to map in the risks that we've identified overall for what we call the enterprise risks or the overall city risks into these areas. And the mapping shows both where these risks are most likely to arise and also where they're being managed. So when we go into audit that area, we know to highlight within our audit plan, how are these risks being managed, in addition to, as we scope it out, very specific process risks also. So that's really what the audit universe is. Is this a final set in stone document? No, it's not. It's something that will definitely evolve over time as we get to understand the city more, but also as time goes on, the risks do change as well. So this is really a living, breathing document that we will continue to update as we continue to update our risk assessment year over year. I'll pause there for a second because I know the methodology may be slightly different. Are there any questions that you have on either the audit universe, how we map the risks in, and the use of the risk framework?
Questions to this point? Okay, Caroline?
Okay, at this point, I'll turn it over to Anissa to actually walk through the planned audits for 2017 through 2020. As Annalisa had mentioned at the beginning, we would like to view the first 2 years of the audit plan really as one 18-month plan. Given the fact that we're really starting the internal audit function as of middle of the year, I think to fit all of these in within 6 months, as some of these areas may be cyclical, et cetera, it may make sense to shift some of these into early 2018. So with that, I will turn it over to Anissa.
Thank you, Catherine. So if I could just draw your attention to our page 8 within the internal audit draft plan. What we're going to do is we're going to spend some time walking through FY 2017 as well as FY 2018 to be able to look at the proposed projects. And as Catherine and Annalisa mentioned, we want to look at this as an 18-month plan because there could be some possibility where timing will shift. What's important to keep in mind, though, is that the descriptions within the plan are kept very high level. Once the plan is approved, we will meet with management to further scope the reviews as well as define the criteria and the objectives further. And Deloitte will spend time in terms of creating a scoping document as well as a charter with management to be able to ensure that the review is scoped within the budget allotment, which you would have seen on page 15 of the plan, which is our estimate for the various projects. Also, as we work through the various projects, we'll ensure that we have subject matter expertise to be able to deliver on certain specialized projects. The other key aspect to keep in mind is that the internal audit plan will be refreshed annually. So as you look out towards FY 2019 and 2020, there could be a possibility that depending on a change in strategic initiatives or inherent business risks to the organization, you may look to move some of your projects around. And also, if I can draw your attention to page 19, as we go through the various projects, what we've done is we've created rationale for why projects are within the plan. So as I walk through this, you may want to have this readily available. How projects made it into the plan was based on 5 criteria. Those criteria were key inherent business risks, if it was suggested by the Audit Committee or suggested by management, if it was aligned with key initiatives or business strategies that the City of London is undertaking, as well as the concept of if it was not audited recently. So when we look at your audit universe, which Catherine had walked us through, there was a particular area that wasn't looked at in the past. We'd want to spend some time to look at that area as well. And then also, which overlays all of the projects, is the ability to look at leading practices, trends within local government in terms of what we're seeing within other municipalities, what we see within the sector and industry as well, which drives certain projects that have landed in the plan. So with that in mind, starting on page 8, the first project we have falls within the internal audit universe area of solicitor. Based on the discussions, we consider this a medium prioritization in terms of the way the ranking had fell. This project is freedom of information process assessment. So within this review, we'll spend time looking at the processes and controls in terms of providing information and documentation to the public, as well as the confidentiality around the information that's maintained within this process. The next area is looking at human resources, and this is a high prioritization area based on the risk assessment that we had undertaken. And we have 2 projects that are proposed. The first one in FY 2017 is looking at a management compensation process assessment. Here we want to be focusing on the controls, including change management, looking at the process, the validity, accuracy, timeliness, the organizational structure as it falls within management compensation, as well as the reporting lines and the confidentiality of the data and how that's maintained and shared as appropriate. The other item that falls within human resources is health and safety in FY 2018. Within this particular assessment, we'd be looking at the governance, maturity, and effectiveness of your health and safety practices and the compliance to those practices within the city in terms of the policies and procedures that are in place. The next audit universe area is looking at finance and treasury. And in FY 2018, we have proposed a procurement process assessment. And within this review, we'd be looking at the controls in place around your centralized procurement, looking specifically at your purchase to pay cycle, recognizing that the city is undertaking a newly implemented e-procurement system. So we'd want to be able to ensure that the business process controls are aligned with the changes within that system as well. The next area is information technology, a high prioritization area for the city. And within this, we have 4 projects proposed over FY 2017 and 2018. The first one is looking at a cyber risk workshop. Now, this is something that we had proposed in our discussions with management. And this is around a 1-day workshop where we can look at the inventory of the key cybersecurity threats to the city and looking at what processes the city has in place to mitigate those threats. The other project is an IT project portfolio management assessment. And here we'd be looking at a life cycle of projects, looking at when a project is started to the end user and the delivery and closure of that project within the city. In FY 2018, the IT security assessment, that would be an outcome of the cyber risk workshop where we would take one high priority area and be able to look at the experiences that the city has within that particular item and evaluate the controls that are in place and ensure that the right security measures are in place. We'll also look at the class replacement project. We'll get into a little bit more details under Parks and Recreation, but within this project, we'd be looking at the control framework that's in place and ensuring that the controls are working effectively. Okay, so now we are on page 10. And within page 10, under the Audit Universe section of Administration and Compliance Services, we have in 2018 a parking revenue generation assessment, which we're proposing. Here we want to look at the framework of controls that are in place, looking at improvements and also benchmarking to what we've seen in other local government. The next item is building, and here we're proposing a building permit process assessment. Again, just looking at your building permit process, looking at the controls in place and ensuring compliance across the city. The next area is engineering, and this is a high prioritization area for the city. Starting in 2018, we are proposing looking at your rapid transit projects. So as we understand, the project is underway, but it will be taking off in the 2018 timeframe. So here what we're looking at is that internal audit will assess a facet of your different items that fall within rapid transit, and we'd be looking at your milestones, we'd be looking at project management, as well as looking at the assessment of tendering and awarding. We would scope this a little further once we understand what the milestones have been set and the criteria that management has put in place. In terms of housing, in 2018, we're proposing a housing process assessment. So here we'd be looking at an efficiency and effectiveness of the housing processes, as well as specific emphasis on the financial controls that are in place. And we'd also be looking at possibly, as we work through the scoping, including an evaluation of the Housing Development Corp, as well as the London and Middlesex Housing Corporation, as they fit into that particular review. And on page 12, under Neighborhood and Children's Services, we're proposing a homeless prevention management process. So here it's looking at your processes and controls with specific emphasis on operational and financial controls. And then finally, what we have under Parks and Recreation is we're proposing a cash handling process review. So we understand that the city has their own process and controls around ensuring that cash is managed appropriately. So in terms of this review, we'd be taking a sample of your parks, your outdoor facilities, any recreational facilities, and look at the testing that is done, and also complete our own assessment in terms of the controls that are in place and the process that management undertakes to ensure that cash is handled appropriately. And then finally, we have the class replacement project. And as I mentioned before, it would be evaluating the control framework and the processes and the business processes also around the new implementation of the class system within the city. And finally, if I could draw your attention to page 14, there are other activities of internal audit that we would be completing on an ongoing basis throughout the year. The first, of course, is the annual internal audit planning. We'd also be completing our audit committee and management reporting as required. We'll have attendance at management meetings, again, as required. And we also plan on having coordination with the Lean Six Sigma team, as well as the service review teams. Because based on the work of those two particular areas, we want to ensure that we're not overlapping, or where it does make sense, we can gain efficiencies both from the work we've done or the work that they've done as well too, to be able to minimize the impact on city employees as required. And then finally, we'll complete quarterly follow-ups on outstanding observations, those that will be ranked at a medium or high priority that will be brought back to the audit committee to be able to talk about progress that management has made and closure of observations. I'll pause there for a moment to see if you had any particular questions around any of the projects that I had gone through.
Okay, I'll look to the committee. Anyone? I see a finger. Is that a?
I'm still formulating a question.
Formulating the question. Okay.
If someone else has one before me, then go ahead.
Anyone have a comment or a question? Mr. Hayward?
Through the chair, yes. One of the important parts here is when we start to look at the scoping of these projects, there are obviously staffing impacts as we go through some of these. So we're going to be working with Deloitte to make sure we're scoping them appropriately and we minimize the impacts on staffing as well. And that's a discussion I've had with Deloitte already. So the way some of these are written in terms of the high level has this impression that they're going to be massive projects. And I think as we move it down, scope them down, I think they will shrink a little bit and be more manageable.
Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for the overview. It's, I think these are very important areas to be investigated, and I think they'll be very helpful. For the most part, I see the timing as appropriate. I did have a couple of questions on some timing of things that have been extended out into 19 and 20, and why were they were placed there rather than their placement earlier in the process. Specifically, the two that I was wondering about was with respect to, I guess I'm kind of curious why it's under economic innovation, the emergency planning process review, all the business continuity pieces. That's on page 9 and set for fiscal year 2020. Business continuity being one of those pieces that if we don't have that in order, then everything kind of falls apart when things are in trouble, and that's 3 years down the road for us. The second question was with respect to the development charges process assessment. The Development Charges Implementation Committee is convening now, and will have delivered its recommendations in 2019 for approval for, I think, for bylaw in 2019. So placing it in 2020 places it after that review process has gone through, and that might be important information to help inform the process as that committee is convened and is meeting.
Let's get a couple answers on those ones. The development charges, and then there was the other one, the disaster. Business continuity.
So I'll answer the business continuity one first. The understanding is that there's an RFP going out for a creation of a new business continuity plan. And our thought and the timing was that it'd be good to complete that planning process and then review it as part of the completion of that to ensure that it covered the areas that we would expect from a risk perspective.
And the DCs?
So the development charge, that's good input that we should take back to educate the plan as we move forward into 2019. So I guess one question would be, do you think it should be 2019 or 2018?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. I think Mr. Hayward would probably be able to help inform this a little bit, but the bylaw is supposed to be in place for 2019, so the process leading up to that, I think, would be probably 2018, but perhaps Mr. Hayward, you could help with that.
Mr. Hayward?
Through the chair, just to answer the question directly, yes, 2019 is when the final bylaw will be going through. Actually, it's August 2019. But if you read the description here, it's actually assessing the CIP process and control framework for development charges and grants provided to developers. So it's really about more the CIP piece. The reason development charge piece came in as a title, I think, is because that's part of the grant process that we have. So I think that's the discussion we have, and maybe the title is a little bit misleading.
Thank you. Yeah, I recognize that part. I think, but even through the development charge setting, is the discussion about the CIPs, especially the downtown and the industrial CIPs themselves, I believe. And those are, I thought, central to the conversation that happens at the Development Charge Implementation Committee.
Through the chair, actually, we're discussing the portion of the CIPs now. And so they'll be implemented 2018, 2019, the changes. So probably 2020 would be a good time to evaluate what's going on with them. There are a number of other changes, I think, that are coming forward from planning services and finance on CIPs, as well as the changes specifically. I think the latest report dealt with the downtown development charge exemptions and tax back grants, and I think we're also looking at the industrial DCs as well. That doesn't factor directly into the DC discussion because they're not part of the DC bylaw, but it does factor into the overall decision-making of council. And I think this was really going at the processes that we have for those grants and for issuing those grants and making sure that they're reasonable and there's controls around them. But I'll let the Deloitte speak to that specifically.
As we look at that particular review, I think what we'd probably have to be able to confirm is what timing within the process we'd like to look at it. If you'd like us to look at the framework that is proposed and the changes in the controls, then I think from a timing perspective, moving it forward would make sense. Or if it would be after that, once it's changed and been implemented, then to verify that the process is working effectively. So we can take that back and have conversations with management to see what makes sense in terms of the timing. But I think looking at it, it would be a different type of review if we brought it forward or if we kept it later. Just the scope of it.
No, it's just, thank you very much, and I think that would be a helpful discussion to have. I appreciate both perspectives on that. If we're in the process of doing things, helping and having information to help guide a process that we're in place, or retrospectively taking a look at decisions that had been made and how effectively they've been implemented, those are two different perspectives, and absolutely would influence the timing where that would land. So I think philosophically, I feel comfortable kind of leaving that in your discussion with the administration to figure out where that best is suited. But that was the one that jumped out for me. Thank you.
Thank you, through the chair to perhaps to staff. Regarding the review of the building permit process, I think we recently updated that process. Is that correct?
I believe there are a number of changes going on with the Amanda system and a revisiting of the processes as well surrounding that to automate them more. But I'll have to check into more detail on what the specifics are.
Okay, so I'm just wondering if the timing of that was a little too soon or it could be perfect, depending, because I knew that was happening, but so if we can look into that. I'll pass it on to my colleagues.
So the question I have is just with respect to more of a high-level question. I believe we mentioned that the freedom of information process was a medium risk. The management compensation process is high risk. And I think the only thing I'm trying to determine is what might have been considered a high risk that we can't see on this. So for example, under building permit process, I can't tell from this if it's a high risk or medium risk. But secondly, if there was another risk within one of these categories that was also high risk and we had to make the trade-off, I'm trying to figure out if there are any other high risk items that were not presented on the plan, but you identified as high risk.
Jim or Kathy?
So looking at our Appendix C, Appendix C actually has our risk prioritization and the audit universe coverage. So this is from a prioritization perspective through the discussions we've had and our understanding, because we are still in the learning process. There is a column that says prioritization, and this is where we've done the ranking from the medium, high, as well as low areas. So what we have identified and have worked on is that those that fall within the high area, we're at least covering off those specific risks. I should say prioritization based on the timing of when the strategic item is taking place within the city, or depending on if there's a change taking place, are we going to look at something before or after? So that's where we've come up with our prioritization, if that answers your question.
So the only thing I think I'm missing still is just within each of the internal audit universe, there's sub-processes within. And I don't believe that, unless I'm reading this wrong, is that included in Appendix C, or is that a sub-appendix that we haven't received?
I can answer that. So we don't have all of the sub-processes listed within here. So there is sort of a tree that has additional detail. And, at this point, I would say that it's partially complete, but we don't have full sub-processes within there. But based on the risk assessment that we've performed, we do believe that the high priority ones, and when we say high priority, there may be areas that are high risk, that have been either covered through audits in the past or management is currently working on them, so it doesn't make sense to look at it right now. But we feel that this covers off, high priority areas that are considered priority for internal audit to look at over the next 4 years. There was no projects that were identified that did not make it somewhere within here that were considered high priority.
Thank you. I want to ask you about the one-day cyber risk workshop. I think that's something you've done before, it seems like, and one of my questions was, when you refer to the city, is that including the boards and commissions? I wanted to know who you think is going to be involved in this workshop.
And that's something where we haven't finalized the actual scope of it. What we initially envisioned was more the city proper, and not the boards and commissions, but that's something we could entertain and see how that would, because that would involve a number of different environments, I imagine, and not just the city's IT infrastructure.
Can you describe a little more what goes on during that one day?
So again, it's something that right now, it's not totally formulated, the plan for that day. But again, normally what you would do is look at, do some pre-work ahead to determine what are some of the risks that could be presented to the city from a cyber risk perspective. And then it is somewhat of an education for the people in the session to go through those risks and talk through what the mitigations are for those risks, whether it's technological controls or process controls, or even just controls around educating the people, looking at the people process technology that mitigate those risks, and then looking at where there may be gaps in that, because there are things that just can't be covered by those three elements, and you look to insurance and other avenues. And then taking that out of the outcome of that project, the process would be to look at future projects. So in year 2, we have a project around IT security that is intentionally vague, because what we do is use that to educate that planning for the next year. So that's the high level of how we would conduct that.
And how many staff members do you think would be involved in that with you?
Usually those sessions are best if there's 10 to 20, like in that 15 mark. You get too many, and you get too many opinions as you go through that process. And you're too few, you don't get enough input from the various stakeholders or sharing of information. And that might be a determination in who's included in that actual session from a boards and committees perspective, is how large would that group be.
If I could just pick up on that, I understand what you're trying to accomplish with that thing, that one session. We might want to go through that, and then we might want to see if there's some value of offering that to either boards or commissions, or quite frankly, it could be a value add that we take out to the community, because it's an area of some interest in the community. But let's go through the first one and then talk about it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to quickly, beyond housing, was there much investigation or consideration of external agencies that provide services for the city, that we have an obligation to ensure that they're provided, that we're I guess part of the realm of the city's universe, we deliver things directly, or we have others deliver those for us, and there's certain accountabilities that we might have associated with the delivery of those services when we're using contracted services. Housing services are about the only one that lands in here that's considered, but were there others, and how do we contemplate where our risk lives with those? I think just off the top of my head, as a random example, would be something like animal services, animal control services, for example.
Yeah, for any audit that we have here, what we call outsourcing risk, or third-party risk would be considered as we go through the scope. So definitely, I think you're correct, it probably would come into the scope within the housing area, but as we go through any of the other projects, we would look at that as well. In as much as it's not covered within these 4 years of projects, I think as we update our plan each year, one question we did ask in many of the interviews was, is there a lot of the processes within your area that are actually outsourced, and how is that managed? So I think also as we go through the procurement review, there will be an aspect there of looking at vendor management. So we will touch on it from that standpoint in terms of, what service levels are in place, how is that monitored, et cetera. So I think we will be touching it in a few different places.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. I'm cognizant of kind of two big risks, and one is an actual liability associated with a required delivery of a service, and the second is a reputational risk, where our contractor may not have executed in the way that we might need to ensure that there's oversight to secure that. So I'm glad there's some mind to that. That's helpful. Thank you.
Sameed?
So both a comment and a question with respect to Appendix B. So it's the audit plan rationale. I think the first comment is, I really enjoyed the schedule. I think the schedule is very helpful to help the committee understand why we're looking at what we're looking at. My question was with respect to aligned with key initiatives. I just want to confirm what that list was. Is it the list that's right in the front page, the overview section where we had our the four following initiatives: strengthening the city, building a sustainable city, growing the city, and leading public service? Or is this a subset that you've taken from somewhere else, from management or some other? So I'm just looking for the source documentation for a key initiative.
So it is definitely the list in the front, but also we read through the strategy for the city and just in discussions with management as well, any key initiatives that were underway. For instance, the rapid transit was one that came up very frequently in terms of initiatives. So it comes from a few different sources, but I would say the main ones were the strategy document and discussions.
Okay. One more. Go ahead.
So just as we talk about the fiscal 17, fiscal 18 plan, looking at it 18 months, I guess I'm just curious about how much, I don't know what the right word is, how much allocated time to any additional projects that might come up based upon what happens in the city. Is any of that built in this? Is this schedule at capacity? Understanding that we've already trying to look at seasonality and other items that might happen. Just curious of if there's any room at this.
Yeah, at this point, we have built up the audits to the full proposed price that we had, which is in the schedule. I think if there was any item that was determined as higher priority, we would need to look at, is there something that we could either reduce the scope? If we haven't performed the audit yet, we could actually reduce scope on one area to use that time towards the newly identified audit, or perhaps defer it to a later year. Or, I imagine there's a process to look at budget as well to see if there's something beyond the identified budget that's in the plan.
Councillor Halber.
Thank you. I wonder, in terms of the timing of the projects and when we'll be reporting out, I wonder if we could speak to how it's going to align with our amendment process for the multi-year budget. One of the things I've noticed in the internal audits in the past, sometimes things get identified and we want to make some changes coming out of the audits. Some of those things require resources to actually make those changes happen. And as much as we can, I want to quickly feed in the results from the internal audit through whatever decision-making process we're going to have around making improvements, and then make sure that it actually gets budgeted if if it's something that requires a budget. So I wonder how it's going to feed into that overall process.
Often when there's a strong budgeting process in place, part of the management's response is to consider what budget they have to actually implement the changes that might be in response to any identified internal audit findings, and ensure that they're actually reasonable timelines based on the resources available, whether it's money or people or technology and that sort of thing. So that's definitely a consideration. It's something that we do critique as we see the responses from management, is to ensure that they actually have considered whether they really can implement in that time frame.
I have a couple questions. One is the rapid transit one that's slated, and it says each year beginning in 2018, a facet of the rapid transit project based on milestones reached will be reviewed. And I guess I'm going to maybe leave this as an open question at this point. You know, 2018 is not all that far away, frankly, and I'm not sure what we're going to really have, particularly we're thinking Q1, Q2, to really audit in 18. And so I just want to raise that as a question. I appreciate the milestones piece, and it could be as simple as looking at the Gantt chart and saying, geez, we're 6 months off on our Gantt chart. Like, it could be that, you know, limited in scope for what Gantt charts are worth, but most of them are out of date before they're given to the authors, frankly. Or it could be much more profound. And I think I would like to just raise that as a question and leave it with administration, that we take a look at that at the beginning of 2018, and how many ergs are dedicated to that in terms of the resources, and whether that's the appropriate start time for that, or whether it's late 2018, early 2019. I totally agree with the comment of looking at the next 18 months. It aligns with a new council coming in. It aligns with, you know, refreshing the new council in 18, early 19 will be looking at their strategic plan. So I think that's perfect. I really do. I think that's really appropriate. My question would be then this year, and just in terms of the work product that we would be seeing this year, and if we go to the 2017 on page 8 and 9, and would we be seeing these reports in September? Like, would we start to see reports in September at the September meeting? Or is that going to be too soon, and would they be all just, you know, coming at the 4th or early into the first quarter of?
Yeah, I think it's realistic that we will likely have 1, possibly 2 reports by September. So if I look at what's potentially going to be able to be done by then, potentially the IT cyber workshop could be done by then. We could have a report on what's come out of that, potentially the cash handling review as well. So, you know, I think our first couple of months will be, pulling together some of our protocols, our charter, as well as scoping quite a few of these reviews, getting into detailed scoping. But I do think, you know, probably 1 or 1 to 2 smaller ones may be doable by the end of September.
And just on the first one, the Freedom of Information Process assessment, it depends on what you define financial effectiveness and efficiency as. So I want to make sure that, you know, we charge, what is it, $5 $5 to file a Freedom of Information. And it, I mean, quite frankly, as soon as that paper goes across the desk, it has cost the municipality more than $5 to handle it, okay? So, you know, depending on what you mean by financial effectiveness and efficiency, I'd like to know partially, are we charging the right amount for filing a Freedom of Information request, given that many of them, although I cannot confirm nor deny, my suspicion is many come from members of the media. And, you know, $5 is to help them do their job, but it really is using a lot of resources from the city to accomplish that. I know there's factors connected to that, but I hope that the report, when we get into that, looks at how many hours, how much, how many, and is that, we do that with all other areas of bylaw where it has to, we're not making money, but we're covering costs. And that's what I'll be wanting to look for that. So that's kind of more on the, little bit on the value for money piece. And I don't know what the requisite, I've already got the clerk and the city solicitor chatting in the back about it. I've got them worried already. And I'm sure there'll be a legal comment on it at some point, not today. And there'll be, but that should be part of that audit, I would think, so. Okay. Any other, yeah, Councillor Helmer and Councillor Hopkins. Oh, Councillor Hopkins first, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the report. I have a question around housing and how you define housing. I notice in the areas you speak to housing, and I heard you refer to HDC and London Middlesex housing. And then as we go into further on in the report, you refer to housing again. I just want to make sure I understand that definition and what that entails.
So in terms of housing in the internal audit universe area, the first housing that you see where the review is taking place, that would be housing from the city's perspective. So looking at the organizational chart, the housing departments and units that fall within that. When we see housing occur again, it's more under the agencies, boards, commissions, and the corporations where we've listed out what those commissions and boards are, where again, there could be the potential that others could be scoped in once we complete the detailed scoping. But that's the way that we did our original assessment.
And following that through to the Appendix C, when you speak to housing and looking at the long-term plan, when we look at housing process assessment, if you can again define housing.
It would be defined the same way. Yeah.
I'm very happy to see the building permit process review happening this year. I know it's ranked as a low prioritization, and I understand that in terms of the risk perspective. I think that's appropriate, but I'm glad we're looking at it. Just thinking back to last year, we had something like $1.4 billion of construction value in the City of London, right? It all went through that building permit process. And so it's obviously a key part of the economy, and I think it's something we need to constantly stay on top of to make sure that it's functioning as well as it possibly can and that it's properly resourced. And that from a customer sort of satisfaction perspective, that process is working for people as well. So I'm glad that one's happening now. I'm hopeful that we can find some areas where we can improve.
Committee, anything further? Then I think the appropriate motion would be to receive the internal audit plan. And Michael, did you want to move that?
Yes.
Okay, Michael's moving that. I'm not used to us waving anymore. So to move and endorse the internal audit plan. Receive and endorse, I guess would be the best language. A seconder for that, Councillor Turner. Any further discussion? Okay, I'll call the question. All in favor? Okay, thank you very much. And thank you. Good start. Our next audit meeting is the one that we get to hear from our friends from KPMG. We have a date for that, do we not?
Yes.
And what is the magical date?
June the 12th, I think?
Oh, it's not June 12th.
No, sorry, 19th, June 19th. That day.
Yes, it's a 12 noon meeting on June 19th. Is that right? Okay, just double checking. June 19th, 12 noon. Okay. Thank you very much. I'll have a motion to adjourn. Hopkins, seconded by Van Holst. All in favor? Thank you very much. We'll see you in June. You folks are welcome to come too if you have nothing more exciting to do.